back to like building the relationship. And I think
Mhm.
like I sometimes get worried because I'm like, when I go to conferences and present, I'm like, that sounds very sentimental. And like, what does
Mhm.
that look like in a pragmatic sense? And that's a fair question. But I do feel like if you hold back to that cheat code of like, just be curious about people, even in a professional setting, you'll get to those storytelling projects or like where you really get that human depth in your work that makes it real and impactful. So,
Welcome to the Storycraft Podcast for Storytellers. I'm your host, Meg Adams, and I'm here to help you explore how stories shape our connections. Wondering how stories help you network and advance? Looking to bridge online and face-to-face worlds, foster understanding, and ignite innovation? Look no further. Whether you're a leader, communicator, educator, or just love a good story, join us for actionable insights and real talk with professional storytellers, all aimed at helping you build stronger, better connections.
So we're here today with Jake King, Communication Strategy and Diversity Specialist with the City of Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. And Jake, I'm so excited to have you here because as we were talking briefly before recording, Jake is really at the center of communication and diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'm not going to speak for him. Excited to dig into that because that's one thing that listeners of this podcast were really interested in talking more about and figuring out, that is, how do we have conversations with people who are different than us? And when I say different, I mean, across socioeconomics, politics, gender, all kinds of things, right? We really want to be able to have better, more productive conversations so we can come up with better, more productive strategies to solve, problems that you're probably seeing at a community level, but that goes all the way up to a global level. So that kind of might help us frame our conversation, Jake, but super excited to dig into all things storytelling with you. So for our listeners, to give them some context of your background, can you talk a little bit about your career as a storyteller?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I always love getting the opportunity to talk to you because you've been so influential in, storytelling and communications for me. So I graduated from the University of Findlay 2018, which makes me feel so old to say, which is weird. And so I graduated with a double major in public relations and Spanish. And so I don't think I had a trajectory of like, oh, I really want to work in local government, but as life would have it, that's where I found myself and I really enjoy it. So I started originally doing, I moved from Ohio to Madison, Wisconsin, which is a really interesting place. It's not like any other part of Wisconsin. And I was doing kind of like community marketing and outreach where I was using some of my Spanish skills it was like a dental clinic that really helped underserved folks. And so I kind of got to know the area and apply some communication skills. And then I transitioned to work as like a program coordinator for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is a nonprofit for our county. It's Dane County here in Wisconsin. And then that led me to kind of my role here at the City of Sun Prairie, where I'm leading our public relations efforts. And then I'm also embedding the values of diversity, equity, inclusion in our organization, how we serve the community. And although it's a really weird kind of role, the two kind of very interestingly, and we'll get into this later, interact with each other. That's a quick Spark Notes version of it, or now as the kids would say, like a Chat GPT summary of it.
Oh no,
To go over
yeah, that's the chat. I love that. Oh, okay. So we'll go beyond the chat GPT summary, Jake. Tell me about some of the storytelling efforts that you've had in your current role.
One of my favorites, I would say, so for Black History Month, I was really focused on like, well, what is Sun Prairie's Black history? And so context, I live in Madison, which is the capital of Wisconsin. I work in a nearby city called the city of Sun Prairie, and it has really boomed. It's really growing. It's diversifying. And so even our demographics are changing. And I've always wanted to know like, well, what's our Black history? And so I've met with some of the relationships I've built, some of our Black and African American community leaders, and I just invited them and said, like, would you tell your story of like, what's something you wish Sun Prairie knew about your history here that they don't? And so again, these were exclusively Black and African American community leaders. And the film series, it's kind of like mini documentaries that I did. It's called Sun Prairie Did You Know? And so real quick, one of them, Donna Mackey, she is a phenomenal storyteller, but she was one of the first Black residents to come to Sun Prairie and also teach race relations in the schools even before DEI was common language that we use today. And so being amongst the first Black community members, of course she experienced racism, and of course she had some firsthand experience, but she still has such an impact on the community. And we just told her story. So that's one snippet. I would say to your question about, hey, what does storytelling look like? And how has that helped of like building relationships in the community?
That's a great snapshot. I love that you made that, I'm guessing, like a whole campaign of video stories. Why do you guys choose video to tell those stories?
So and some of this goes back to when we were doing like PR campaigns and digital storytelling, even in your classes of like, I think we're gravitating more and more towards being like a visual kind of culture and society when you think about TikTok and YouTube and all these things. And I also think too of like I wanted a way for folks to bring in different artifacts that had importance to them. So
Mm,
Donna brought in photos of where she used to live, which was like military housing because her husband was in the military, to like certain parts of the community that don't look like that anymore to provide historical background. So I really wanted to incorporate it as like it helps give the story life in addition to the person telling the story.
mhm.
So we would have B-roll of, certain things of Donna's family, of her teaching kids in the school. And so it just really kind of brought the story to life. And so that's why I chose video. And I really like video personally too. So
How did you feel hearing those stories as someone who, in your role, right, as communication strategist and sort of working to build these relationships, and especially to highlight the stories of, Black members of your community? How did you feel in doing that work?
well, what's really cool is that, part of my role, I have a lot of coffee dates just to get to know
Mm,
people. It's not even like
mhm,
even always coming with an agenda or just to like really get to know the community. And so a lot of the stories I've heard already, and they've had an impact on me of really getting to know the community I'm serving. And so I think my mind was like, well, I'm leading communications, I'm leading diversity, equity, inclusion. How do I marry the two and be able to kind of replicate that same impact folks had on me just over coffee? But like in a way that would still feel authentic to the person telling the story, but could be shared with the masses. And so it was just really cool. And you could see people like, I think you can tell when people like telling their story and they feel comfortable and they trust that you're going to use it for good purposes. And so, we had our county sheriff, Calvin Barrett, who he's, a Black community leader too. And we had all these individuals come and just like share their story. What was it like in the 70s or 80s in Wisconsin and some prairie? And you heard some hard stuff, but you also heard some like, hey, I'm seeing the times change though. I'm seeing more Black and African American students excel or exceed these things. And so it was just really encouraging and awesome all around.
I love all of that. But I especially love that you mentioned that you had coffee dates. Like you reached out
Mhm.
to these people without an agenda. I feel, why is that an important, or why was it an important precursor to like, hey, I want to get your story on video. Hey, I have these goals as, in my role in communication
Mhm.
and DEI, right? But you took the time to, like, as you mentioned, build those relationships first without this project or other projects in mind. Why did you do that, Jake?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I'm glad you like highlighted or picked up on that because one of the things, even when I'm working with staff, when we're looking at equity and planning development or equity and, just our city services is like relationships really do carry you. And I think sometimes like in PR, we think like, oh, we just have to be like nice and like network and that is good and important. But like when you're dealing with things like equity and inclusion and race and like historical injustice, like and if you're wanting to work with the community, you have to build a relationship. And what I mean by relationship is like get to know the person. Like just be curious. Like, oh, like why did you come here? Like, why did you stay? Like what like ask those like very intentional questions. And so I think people trusted me enough to say, like, okay, like I know enough about you that I think you're going to use this story for like educational purposes or good purposes. I'm willing to give you my story and do that. But I think the ingredient is always like see the person as the person and like build a relationship, and that will just carry you far. Not even professionally, but just like you know personally too.
Yeah, absolutely. I see like the fruit of planting those seeds in my own life, as a business owner and professor and all the other roles that I hold. I do think, I'm curious to know too, like, especially in your position, like you mentioned in public relations, but also with that very neat um partnering with, like, you're speaking with people who are different than you. And then
Mhm.
they're trusting you, as you mentioned, to represent their story, which is a very vulnerable process. I mean, especially when you're asking somebody to go on camera with what are sometimes, like you mentioned, not the prettiest stories, not they're not
Mhm.
revealing like, hey, everything was rainbows and butterflies in the city all this time.
Okay, we had to pause the podcast to let you in on this opportunity. If you're ready to elevate your brand storytelling, don't miss our training, Tell Better Stories, led by me, a seasoned television journalist and PR professor, and Kyle, an on-air meteorologist and video storytelling expert. This workshop unveils our secrets to craft compelling, personal-driven narratives that resonate with your audience. Learn our distinct approach that puts people first and brands second, leveraging 6 storytelling elements for maximum impact. Walk away with actionable strategies, tactics, and a clear process to replicate success in any organization. Check out the show notes to learn more about this offer or reach out to homeplacecreative@gmail.com.
So do you have any tips for people who may not be as comfortable as you? Because I know you're very outgoing and friendly and chatty, but do you have like go-to strategies or tips for people who may say, hey, like I want to have the same impact in my community. I want to have these conversations. I'm in a similar role and want to do this kind of work, but I'm a little uncomfortable, or because I think it is sometimes uncomfortable when you first meet
Mhm.
someone. How do you make people comfortable so that they're okay to be vulnerable enough to share their, like, genuine stories with you, even at that coffee date?
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember when I first started this role, and I honestly feel like the first couple months, like, I was just it's funny, literally right behind me is a coffee shop called Beans and Cream. I'm in City Hall right now, and I was always there just being curious about the community.
Mm,
Like, I think that is such a cheat code of, like, I just wanna be curious, like, go in and be curious, and even in your personal life of, like, "Hey," I would, just say, like, "Hey, this is my role, I'm with the city, I just wanna know more about you and the work you're doing," and I generally have found that people enjoy talking about themselves and the work that they're doing for the community, and so kinda putting yourself in that student mode of, like, "Hey, I'm just here to learn, and I'd love to talk," and even when I meet with people, I don't immediately get into like, let's talk about work. There are times like I'll crack a joke or like
yeah.
I'll say like, yeah, I was just exploring this trail, whatever. And they're like, oh yeah, I used to take my kids on that trail. And you just kind of get that like rapport and then be like, hey, I'm just here to learn. So like, could I ask you questions? And like, you just help me learn. I find people find that humility super helpful and disarming. And so I think the cheat code is like, just be curious, like, "Hey, why have you been with the school district this long? Like, have you always wanted to do this? Like, what does your partner do?" And people generally, respond pretty well to that. And it just takes time. Like, it can feel awkward at first, but it just takes time.
Such good advice, and I think you're right, and, like, especially when you're new to a community, or, even if have lived in the same community your whole life, but now you're at a point where you're like, "Oh, I want to story tell for impact," or "I want to be a thought leader," right?
Mhm.
Like, all these things require what you just said, which I love, is it takes a genuine curiosity, but also time to build those relationships. So, how long have you been in Sun Prairie? Remind me, how long have you been doing this?
It's weird. This week will make 3 years,
Okay.
and it doesn't even feel like it's felt like it's both been, like, longer, but not that
Mhm.
long.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, like and a lot of it too is like for people in communications, their role, like your job is to kind of know your audience and
Yes.
how they want to communicate or want you to communicate, which is ongoing learning. And so much of the nature of my role is like being a point person in the city for people. And no one's going to really do that if they don't trust or feel comfortable with you. Um, and so, yeah, it's going on 3 years, which time honestly flies. So.
Sure does. That is that the truth for sure.
Mhm.
So the other piece is, like, you mentioned that you don't actually live in Sun Prairie, you live in Madison. So how much do you do, like, in the community of Sun Prairie? How much are you, like, in these conversations with people as you get to know them? Are you sharing stories of yourself? Like, how much are you giving of yourself to that community? I know you have your professional role, but Yeah. What does
Hmm.
that look like?
I always joke and say, because Madison is only, well, from personally where I live, it's, about 35 minutes, but
Okay.
Madison and Sun Prairie are pretty close. But I always joke and say like separation of church and state, and
So it's, yeah, that's a good point. It could be a
yeah,
good thing.
I mean, um, I'm in Sun Prairie quite a bit. Some of it's because like I also just through like my role have developed friends here. So I have friends here and like we'll do stuff. But Madison and Sun Prairie, like if you think about like even the local government side, like our mayors talk. Like
Mm,
we're pretty interconnected. Like we just implemented metro transit. So like buses are coming to Sun Prairie from Madison, all these things. So it's funny that like I live in Madison and I'm a recipient of Madison City services, but I know enough in the background to know what's going on and how they're affecting us in Sun Prairie.
got it.
And so that very much informs like my knowledge of the communities and
Hmm.
how like I see things happening or the direction they're going in. But it also helps because people will come to me and others of us on staff and be like, what's going on here? And so building that rapport of like, we want community members to come to us and ask what's going on. I mean,
Hmm.
don't get me wrong, some people call me at like 9 o'clock at night. And I'm like, all right, I gotta set some boundaries. But yeah, I just think it really always comes back to like building the relationship. And I think
Hmm.
like I sometimes get worried because I'm like, when I go to conferences and present, I'm like, that sounds very sentimental. And like, what does
Hmm.
that look like in a pragmatic sense? And that's a fair question. But I do feel like if you hold back to that cheat code of like, just be curious about people, even in a professional setting, you'll get to those storytelling projects or like where you really get that human depth in your work that makes it real and impactful. So,
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I'm curious. So I'm curious to know. We talked about like the Black History Month, which was this like it sounds like a really beautiful project that had a lot of impact in the community. Because it's very empowering for people to tell their stories and be asked to share their stories, just as much as it impacts the audience to listen to them.
mhm.
But how you had any like storytelling failures or times of crisis where like you were like, oh, thank goodness I built these relationships because I screwed up here. I'm just
Mhm.
also speaking from experience because that has happened to me so many times. I'm like, thank goodness this person knows me as a person and knows that I'm like a
Yeah.
genuinely kind human being, right? Because yeah, I just if there's anything there that you'd be like willing to share about how like um how relationships have helped you or how you've been able to lean on storytelling, and I'm thinking of like crisis communication issues or anything like that.
Mhm. So I would say one was as a student. It was so funny. I think it was in your like storytelling class. And I tell this to staff here when we're talking about like the sensitivity sometimes required when working with, people that are just different than you naturally. I don't think I got a zero on this assignment of yours, but I got close to a zero
Did
because
you?
yeah, it was like we had to write feature stories, and I
Uh-huh.
think I was assigned to interview and do a feature story on a young girl named Raven, I
Uh-huh.
think was her name, um, who had like uh, got into OSU but was from like the Appalachian community, and there was kind of like a story there. And when I wrote the story, the feature story, because we also shared it with the person we were assigned to cover, she read it. She's like, I don't think he like listened to me at all. Like, I don't
Mm,
think he covered this. This is not how I think accurately portrays me. And although it was really humbling, and of course it didn't feel good in the moment, it really was like, oh wow, like I think I was asking her questions not to be curious, but to get something complete and
mm,
just finish. And I
yeah.
don't think I like had a lens of like, let me try to genuinely understand where this person is coming from because they have a different experience than I, and let that inform the way I write and produce content. And so that's just one example of like where I really missed the mark. But what's great is like that's a learning example I give to others of like, hey, this is what happens when like you aren't paying attention or realizing that when you're talking to someone, they have a completely different way of living or thinking about things than you because we're
Hmm.
not all the same.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else that like I don't think necessarily professionally I've had like a bad storytelling moment only for the sense that like I try to check myself of
Hmm.
like get others up input of like, hey, what does this sound like to you? Or like how is this landing? And I do try to let other people tell the story rather than me like tell it for them. So some of those have safeguarded me from like oh, I've had a big pitfall. I'm not saying there's probably more on the horizon, but off the top of my head, those are two examples, or one example I would give of like, although as a student, I just wasn't practicing the principles I'm talking about now because I didn't really think about it. So
Thank you for sharing that story and that answer too. Now I remember that. But you said a couple things in there I'd like to kind of talk a little bit more about for people to help, hopefully, like help our listeners guardrail against some of that stuff too. But one thing you said, and I think I myself can get caught in this sometimes too, Jake, which is storytelling for efficiency, right? Like, hey,
yeah.
I have to get this done. I have this deadline. I'm going to do this as quickly as I can. So, and that's
Mhm.
another thing that like I don't think often gets talked about when you storytell for a living, that like, and you said this, but like having a conversation where you're curious about somebody and like you want to understand their perspective and it's not yours, like that takes time. And you have to be like, I'm going to give a concrete example. Like sometimes you have a coffee date and it's scheduled for an hour and that you've been sitting there for an
Mhm.
hour and a half, but you know it's not polite or right to cut
Mhm.
somebody off where they're at, right? If they're sharing something
Right.
whatever with you, right? So how do you do you have any thoughts on that? Like how do you keep yourself, maybe it's like a balance of efficiency, I don't know, but how do you keep yourself kind of checked there?
Like, in the sense of how do I make sure, even though I still have to honor, like, I'm helping tell a story, but I also still have to honor of what I'm responsible for, which is
Mm-hmm.
like delivering a quality product in like a
Yep,
reasonable amount of time.
exactly.
I think I try a lot of that up front of
Mm-hmm.
like, and I always make the joke just because I'm a jokester of like, this should be like, this is how we should do online dating. We should just be super upfront in the beginning and we would save so much hassle at the end of like, listen, don't put in your profile if you don't like hikes. That way you're not on a date where you're like panting. So
Just
I
be
think,
upfront. I love that.
yeah, I mean, just be upfront. Like, listen, if you're not a dog person, be upfront about that.
Just let me know. Let's not play
Yeah,
games.
just let me know now, save us the heartache. Some of that I try to be like, hey, this is the project and these are the parameters. This might
Mm-hmm.
be like I'm trying to complete this and have videos distributed by Black History Month, this specific date, and this is what I'm looking for. And so I think that way the person has like a framework, either why we're meeting, why I want their story, so I can be honest and direct. And
Mm-hmm.
then once we actually start meeting, I can help they trust me enough to coach them through of like, hey, this is what we're doing. Because I do think sometimes it can be easy of like, how do I want to communicate this? It's their story, but every story, the way you tell it, should know its boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't probably be the most effective or helpful if I was recording someone and they like went on and on and on about their lineage,
Mm-hmm.
with specific names and dates and all that. So some of that is like, hey, let's practice this response now, or here's this question. It's going to be recorded so we can, or not recorded, we can edit or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of that stuff at the beginning will help the process and then the final product of like still honoring the timeline responsibilities and the quality standards, but also having impact and authenticity. I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, that does. That makes total sense. And I think that's a hard question to answer too, because I think every project is probably going to have its own set of not issues, but like you said, boundaries that you kind of have to put on it to make sure that you can strike that balance of, getting something done efficiently, but also being able to do a story justice, right? Although you probably know my answer is always going to be like do the story justice over the efficiency. Like you said, it's sort of
yeah,
in your
yeah.
story. Like I'd always lean there, but I understand you can't just I remember when I was a journalist, I like in my first few weeks on the job, I think I've told you guys this story too. I mean, I would often get in trouble for spending too much time. Like, because we
Mhm.
had we had like 3 or 4 stories that we had to produce and have done. I mean, it had to be done, like had to be done. Like you're slotted for the 5 p.m. news class. And here's Megan having like 3-hour conversations with people.
It's
Like
hard not to sometimes
it
though.
is. So yeah, no, that's good advice. I appreciate that sort of setting those directives and boundaries and making sure that everybody is on the same page, like before you even do anything. That seems like a pretty smart way to deal with some of that. But then the other thing I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in your previous answer was that you sort of have people around you that can like check the content and make sure that you're not misrepresenting anything or that you're not putting it, like too much of yourself into something. can kind of keep you in check. And I think of that sometimes as, as you, and I don't know if you've experienced this shape, but like as you talk to more people, as you have more coffee dates, as you maybe have more hiccups, like you did with Raven, which we all do, especially as storytellers,
Mhm.
it's like my own perspective just widens because I'm a story collector. Now I've collected all
Mhm.
these stories and now I'm more sensitive. And so I'm wondering if you've done that as well, or again, because I know you're busy, like you're working all the time, you got lots of stuff going on. We all have deadlines to hit. How do you
Mhm.
manage that in both your personal and professional life? Like that widening of perspective?
Yeah. Um, and do you mean like as I work on kind of all these different storytelling projects or
Yes.
just different
Yeah.
communications, how do I
In your role in general.
like what does it look like or
Let's go with what does it look like, and then maybe how that's affected you, like, in general.
yeah, I really do think it has taught me of like and some of this gets into those values of diversity, equity, inclusion, and some of it's just maturing as a human of like there are people who go through very different things in life or who have very different experiences or different upbringings, and that informs the way they have their worldview or move about the
Mhm.
world. And so I think that just helps have like a level of empathy because even though I work in like local government and politics, and we're at a time right now where politics is very divisive and strong, part of my role is not that I'm some, like I need to unite everyone necessarily, but it's like I do try to help people understand and influence their work of like, how do we think about other people? And
Mhm.
so we did like an equity audit that I was the project manager for, and we finished that in September. But a lot of it was like learning different demographics in our community. Like, how do you view city services? Like, how do you want your communications received? But when we did focus groups, like we listened to stories, we asked questions, and we had, Black and African American youth. We had primarily Spanish speakers. We had our South Asian. And so it's really kind of, all of them have different perspectives because they've all have different upbringings. And
Mhm.
so I just find into the things I do that like there may be things I post or share or put out or work with departments on that's like this might land with one group, but it might not land with another group. How do we learn about how different people receive information? And to the storytelling piece, I think it's like, everyone just has a different story, and like how do you I don't know, I guess it's just coming in with the fact that, like, people are different than you, and that's not a bad thing. It's just a different thing because we
Mhm.
are all just naturally different people. It sounds like something that would be on, like, a poster or something, but I think my experience has really, like, matured me in that sense of, like,
Mhm.
the way people move and engage with the world comes from their differences, so
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of, I think that's where storytelling, that's like the gift of it, really, because you can, like sharing an experience that you've had and how that's affected you, like giving that to somebody else then allows like their perspective to widen. So now they're going to come at every situation with that story of an experience that they themselves cannot have, like you said, because that's not their upbringing, that's not their worldview. But I can give you a glimpse of it, and then that might change now the way that I interact with the next person I see. Right, we're kind of unraveling a little bit of our own, maybe not unraveling, so we're widening our perspective so that we can be better humans, as you said, like just general maturity there.
Love what you're hearing on this podcast? Consider booking me to speak at your next event. Dive further into the transformative power of storytelling with my keynote. Tell better stories, speak up, stand out, and build community. In a world that often amplifies our differences, my talk invites you to embrace genuine connections. Break free from the echo chambers and discover the art of storytelling. Learn how to share your own narrative, listen actively, and foster communities that flourish on shared experiences. Check out the show notes to learn more about how to book a talk for your next event.
Have you ever run into anybody who, and maybe this is perfect, and you don't obviously don't have to name names, but maybe this is like a constituent or somebody you work with who is maybe just unwilling to either understand your point of view or the
mhm.
position of your department's point of view, and like do you have any strategies for getting past that, or when to just like any boundaries around like, well, we are never going this communication might not be productive, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, To an extent, yes. I'm also, though, in Dane County, which is a very like more progressive and liberal. So when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and creative projects to communicate the values of those things, I don't have as much pushback as I would be from like a different part of Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so I would say though, I would go back to my cheat code of like, be curious about that too. So when someone, like I remember I presented, it's very funny. I was like voluntold to present to this like conference last year where it was a bunch of different city managers and county managers. So like really kind of the CEOs of local government about our DEI journey. And so some of the room I could tell was invested, and some of them I could tell were just like, ugh. And so for me, there's like, I just want to be curious about that because it is
Hmm.
very easy to come to the table wanting to be right. And I have found even in my own personal life that rarely works. If I just come to the table wanting to be right and you're coming to the table just wanting to be right, well, we're both just going to walk away thinking we're right. And so any time where there's been like maybe pushback or something, I just try to remember like, let's actually talk about where that pushback might be coming from. Because I sometimes feel like a lot of the times it's a misconception where an opinion has been built off that misconception. And if you're curious about it, you can like peel away and be like, oh, what you think we're doing, or oh, you might not actually know what we're really talking about. Now we have a better starting point. And so that's just a long-winded way to say, like, just be curious. I mean, when appropriate, sometimes people come at you charged and you're like, all right, there's no way we can even have like a civil conversation about this. But like for people who you can enter into that type of discussion, like just be curious about like, hey, I'd love to hear like why you think this project or initiative isn't impactful or isn't necessary. So
That's a really wonderful piece of advice. I mean, across all difficult conversations, right? To go into it not trying to prove anything, like you said, or try to be right, but just remain curious. Cause I mean, that's interesting too. Cause I think a lot, you could probably dispel a lot of emotions, or like you said, a lot of misconceptions by asking the right questions of people off the bat. So I appreciate that advice, Jake. That's very helpful.
yeah, well, and I'll add too, like, it's so fun. I shouldn't like communicate it this way, but I have to go back to that same conference. I'm invited. It's a privilege. It is a privilege. I just
Hmm.
like was voluntold kind of, but they invited me this year and they were like, what should we title like the session? And I was like, I really do think we should just title the session like, what is DEI and how do you live it out? In
Hmm.
a sense of like, what are we talking about? And I think if you have that kind of attitude when you are with someone who's pushing back on a creative project or doesn't get why you're spending all this time on a storytelling series, highlighting marginalized individuals or whatever it might be, is like, let me just be curious about where your skepticism or hesitancy or, opposition might be coming from. I don't know. I just think that's a very healthy and mature way to go about it.
Yeah, I also think it does something else that is something that I don't think often gets talked about enough with storytelling is it allows people to be heard. And I think that
Mhm.
that's a key thing. I think a lot of times, at least I found in my own personal and professional life, Jake, is if people feel like they're heard, even if you disagree, even if you fundamentally disagree, if you are able to put your differences aside for a moment and say, like you said, just be open and genuine in your curiosity about, okay, where are you coming from? And I think
Mhm.
that's where, storytelling, that's another like really useful thing for people in all communication positions, but even all of us in our daily lives, is that okay, if we can find a commonality, that's also another thing that I do. Like I listen, like, okay,
Mhm.
what's the thing that I have to try really hard, like, what's one thing that I can be like, "Oh, I see," or even the acknowledgement of like, "I see where you're coming from," right? And then we can try and find that commonality, and then we can, like, work from there. But I think that storytelling, we talk a lot about the telling, but not necessarily that listening piece. And
Mhm.
so I think that that's another important part of it. Like, I think a lot of people, especially now, Jake, and I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are in this. You mentioned like the siloing with politics and people really sort of, I think they see an identity marker and then they're like, oh, this person, it must be all of these things. And you
Mhm.
don't get the chance to be heard. But yeah, so how do you, I mean, if they're in your position, I guess too, I'm guessing like a lot of what you're doing is bringing people across differences together. And I'm curious to know if you use any storytelling techniques in like either events or campaigns. Like, how are you involving people to bring, again, people from probably very different perspectives together?
Yeah. I mean, some of them, like intangible ways of my role, like I lead the planning of like our annual multicultural fair, which, brings for celebratory reasons, different folks in the community. So those are tangible ways, but I think of like more strategic, kind of difficult ways is like now that we completed our equity audit, which took like almost 2 years, I work on a monthly basis, one-on-one with each department head to look at like, hey, in our operations, like who are we not including? How are we
Mm.
not being equitable from everything from building inspection to public works to planning to parks and rec, all these things. And so we're having these conversations now. I think so much it is communicating the value of like why would you even want people different than you and from different thought backgrounds at the table, because it produces conflict, honestly.
Yeah.
Like having people from different backgrounds where you don't always see everything is a difficulty, but it is helpful. Like I have mentors in my life for like personal things, whether it's related to faith or just growing as a person, who challenge me on things, but they have different perspectives. They're older than me or whatever, but that's diversity. That's like helping me grow. And so I think if you take that, the ways I'm doing it now is trying to help people see like that's a value.
Mm.
And to get that value, you have to build a relationship with someone who trusts you enough that you would incorporate and listen to them and their differences. So, I mean, yeah, there's a variety of different, like, kind of tangible ways of like incorporating different people. And then a lot of people will come to me and be like, hey, we have this big project and we need this kind of level of community engagement. How do we get people in there? Or how do we get people to engage with this? And so those are different ways where I'm kind of like consulting people on how to build those relationships to get that desired level of public engagement.
What a way to bring us full circle back to that initial comment on trust and relationship building, right? And that's where like the story exchange certainly comes in. So, oh my gosh, that was just an awesome way to kind of wrap us up, Jake. But I do want to give, is there anything that like you feel that we haven't touched on about storytelling in your role that you want to talk about or think may be helpful for our listeners today?
I think, one of the things I'll just keep repeating it is like it has really helped me, and like I'm learning it. So I'm by no means am I an expert, even though I'm saying it is like it's like being curious about people really has helped. And like I try to like remember that of like we want people to be curious about us and be like, what do you like? What do you do?
Yeah.
And so I'm really trying to grow of like really paying attention to people. Like, what do they like? What do they say? How do they say it? And so when it comes to storytelling, like people, when they trust you, I think will share those things. They'll share in a way that like, oh, they're like really telling a story that matters to them, but you won't get to that until like, I think you're curious about people and build a relationship. So if anybody, took anything away from this, it's like, just be curious about people, have coffee and say like, I'd really just like to be curious about what you want to do. Will you teach me? And I found people really like that. So just be curious.
I think I know the title of our episode. But
Yeah.
but no, I wanted to tell you there's this cute movie. I think it's on Netflix. Have you seen it yet? I don't know if you've seen it. Probably not. I have kids, but it's called Leo. Adam Sandler is like this iguana. And
Mhm.
anyways, he helps all these kids in like a fifth grade classroom. It's really cute. But this whole episode reminds me of a scene. There's a little girl in there and she's sort of lonely. She doesn't have friends. And she just like all the time, she's constantly
Mhm.
talking about herself and blah, blah, blah. And Leo is like, well, why don't you try asking questions about other people? And she kind of
Mhm.
stops herself and she starts to learn about her classmates. And then she has friends. It's so sweet, but it really is a simple thing. Kind of, it's sometimes just getting out of your own head, like you said, and being really curious about the world around you and the humans in it. And I think that's a lovely sentiment and piece of advice. And I think most people probably in communications or storytellers might do that naturally, but maybe not. You know what I mean? Maybe it's just a reminder to all of us to like, hey, come back a little bit and get curious about the world instead of being angry, instead of being upset, or instead of being like rainbows and butterflies all the time. Maybe either end of that spectrum, just stay curious about what's happening and
Yeah. Oh
Like,
my
it's
gosh.
really nice. It at least like it takes a load off of me today, Jake. I'm like, well, that's just a very like wonderful way to think about it.
No, well, I appreciate it and I get it. Like I think again as I've like personally and professionally maturing of like just really trying to like hone in on like, okay, like help me talk less and help me be more interested in this
Yeah.
person. And like it's really helped of like, wow, like I really want to know about you, or I really want to try and practice like learning more about people. And so I just think that's an awesome way to kind of go about just being a person, but also in anyone's professional career, whether it's storytelling or not, but storytelling especially.
I love that piece of advice. Thank you. Okay, so we always wrap up with rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Yes.
I
Okay.
work in PR, so I'm definitely ready.
Yes. Awesome. I love that. Okay, so the first one is, what is your favorite story of all time? So this could be like movie, song, book, any genre,
My favorite story of all time.
or
Wow,
at
there's so many.
that would be easier.
Wow, maybe I shouldn't have said I work in PR because I'm a little thrown off by that. My favorite
It's a big one.
story.
Uh-huh.
Hmm. Oh shoot, this is really hard. I have like both like like I don't know. Can we come back to this one? There's so
Okay,
many
yeah.
that
Okay,
we'll
think
come
about
back to
that one. Okay, the next one is, what is the best piece of storytelling advice you ever heard that you want all of us to know? And or the worst piece of advice when it comes to storytelling that you need to warn everybody about?
Yeah. I don't know. I wouldn't say I've been given like direct storytelling advice, or it's just things I've observed and seen. So I would say like when you kind of indirectly learn something.
Mm-hmm.
I would say one is for the or for the good or bad. You can always tell when it's not real. Like you can always tell when it's gimmicky, like people can tell. And
Yes.
so I think if you don't have the relationship beforehand, or you don't spend a quality amount of time helping the person and really getting intimate with their story, people will be able to tell. So I would answer that question with just the statement of like, people can tell, like, or if you're trying to just get through it or kind of just get it done to get it done, like that will come out in the final product. So if you need to bark out time to schedule quality time for it, like mark it out. But yeah, people will be able to tell.
For sure. Oh, great piece of advice,
And
especially
I'll
in
kind of just
today's
add this of
environment.
like, you don't, I don't think you need the fanciest equipment or the most like expert level editing skills to tell a good story. I think it can help. I think it can dazzle, sure. But how many movies do we know that were fantastic films that did not have the special effects and budget that we know and love today? So, like, there's so many avenues to tell a good story, and I'm learning those too.
I love that. Also, such a great piece of advice. Story trumps technology. I agree, I think every time. Yep, that's awesome. Okay, and then final question is, how do you define storytelling in your own words?
Yeah, good question. I would say off the top of my head, storytelling in my own words is a person sharing a lived experience, something that impacted them, but them having the avenue to tell it in their own way. That is still like personal and authentic and impactful to them, and will be personal, authentic, and impactful to others.
Love that definition, Jake. Good job.
Mhm.
Okay, coming back. Have you thought of your favorite story?
Man, I'm really struggling with this. I really did not think like a favorite story, which like
Or one
I.
that you like, or maybe you don't have to narrow it down to one. Just tell us one that you like at the moment. No pressure.
Hmm. Um, I'm gonna answer it really generally because I guess it's Monday and I haven't had coffee and I'm struggling, but I really, really gravitate towards any story, and I've known this in the movies that I watch and the characters I identify with, where like they were in such kind of unfortunate circumstances and they had to exercise a certain amount of grit when all the circumstances were against them and they prevailed. And so I think a lot of in like the action films I watch or the suspense films or like some books, 'cause I'm not like a big reader, or stories I listen to, there's always a person who was just faced with these circumstances and they had to be refined by the grit and they came out better than what they were before.
Love
So
that.
any story that has that, um, so yeah, sorry that's not as specific, but I'm
Underdog
struggling.
stories. You like underdogs.
Underdog
I do
stories.
too.
I
I'm
love
a
underdog
fan. I
stories.
just watched True Spirit on Netflix about based on a true story of Jessica Watson. She solo sailed the world when she was 16.
Mm-hmm.
It was really cool. But yes. Oh, well, thanks, Jake. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure. There's a ton in here, so I'm appreciative of all the things that I've learned by chatting with you, and always learn when I chat with you. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's just been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, as always. Well, I always love catching up and, being able to interact with you. So yeah, anytime. So thanks for taking the time to talk about a great topic of storytelling.
We're so glad you've listened to this podcast episode. If you liked it, would you mind doing us a favor? Share this episode with someone who would be interested in the topic too. We're on a mission to help everyone become a better storyteller. And don't forget to subscribe to the show to get updated every time we release a new episode. Each and every episode is produced, hosted, and edited by us, Meg and Kyle Adams at Home Place Creative. Happy storytelling!